Hey Tim, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I was just smiling because today is storytelling hour for you and I, but I was just in the other room. We're babysitting our grandson today, and my wife went with him to, and they picked a whole bunch of books from the library. And I was watching kind of from a distance as my wife read stories to him. And it's amazing to watch his face light up. And if he didn't understand something, kind of a puzzled look. And grandma would turn the page, but it was too soon, and he'd turn it back. And I'm watching this intrigued as he gets so immersed into this story. And I was thinking about today's storytelling hour. You see what I did there? I just told a story about telling stories, and so here we go.
It's fascinating that stories compel us, not just as adults, but also as children. I'm wondering, what it is about stories that make them such good tools to share information.
Well, I think this is my perception because I devour books, some nonfiction, but if you give me a good murder mystery, I can stay up till 2, 3, 4 in the morning and read till it's finished. So I think there is something that allows you to transport yourself from perhaps the worries and cares of your current situation, whatever you're going through right now, into another era where you can suddenly just take it in and you can imagine yourself, or you can imagine these things happening and somehow you relate to it. So I think there's a part of that as well.
Well, there's a couple things going on that I've observed in storytelling. Whenever I brought it into my classes, firstly, it seems to speak to a lower level of the individual, something beyond the consciousness that people can engage with emotionally, not just intellectually. And then, a good story also sort of like pulls everybody together. And there's some type of consensus going on with stories that really fascinate me. A good storyteller can actually get everybody thinking the same concept in the room. Maybe might not be in the same manner, but that same concept is in everybody's head.
So let me change the word consensus to connection.
Here we go.
I'm thinking that a lot of time, in fact, if you're trying to, as us as executives or as project manager or as technical people, if we're trying to get a particularly difficult concept across, sometimes rather than explain the technical details, we get into a little story and suddenly you watch the light bulbs pop on. And you're a teacher. I imagine you can see that in your classroom.
Oh, yeah. And I have a bunch of stories, and we'll talk about this, that I know that actually transmit not the explicit knowledge, but the tacit knowledge. For somehow, I don't know how it works, but somehow we're able to share information in such a way that I don't have to write out a certain number of steps. It's just you create and you weave this world, and you bring people into your world, and then you lead them through a path, and everybody just sort of emotionally follows along.
Well, I think emotionally and I think experientially, because a lot of times a story will connect you with some reminder of something that may have happened in the past. And as a result of that, the connection is made. I was in a situation where I met some people last Sunday, and they mentioned to me that they were from Yukon, Oklahoma, which meant nothing to me. I did a project in Oklahoma City, but Yukon, Oklahoma really meant little to me from my experience until they said it was the Czech capital of Oklahoma. Now, my heritage is Czech. Mm-hmm. I grew up in a Czech community in Canada, and so that was very, very vital to me in terms of my roots. And so suddenly the common interest from a little story they told about Yukon, Oklahoma, and my Czech heritage connected us as though we'd known each other for years.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I rely on when I use stories in my classroom. If you'll give me 5 minutes, let me give you an example.
Yeah.
One of my favorite topics is the code of ethics, right? Values and virtues and all those wonderful things. And I stumble upon, what do I do with people who are intentionally trying to make themselves right and others wrong? This is a huge hindrance when we come up into decision making or we try to move as a group forward. And I created a little device called a hammer. This isn't Maslow's hammer where you're always looking for a nail to hit, but it's a hammer that is uniquely designed for one and one purpose only. It's designed to put a nail into wood, and it does it really well. Now, the problem is with hammers is just what makes them really well to put nails into wood also makes them very good for breaking windows. And at this point, I step out of the story and I ask my class, does that make the hammer bad? It's designed for a good thing. It's used for a bad purpose. And we lead the story and we write the story together, which is really exciting, where it seems that the hand is actually determining the good or bad use of the hammer. And then I very craftily bring in, what about humans? What's the hand behind humans that guides them? And we explore that and we talk about it and we find out its behaviors, opinions, and perceptions. So it allows me to lead them down the common philosophical path that says people are not good or bad. It's the intentions and behaviors of people that guide our actions that make them good or bad. So these stories are not just something that, I'm giving new knowledge to you and you're giving new knowledge to me. It's stories that we all have inside ourselves for certain reasons.
Well, and stories that you can relate to. And if I may, in your experience, the one about the hammer, what if you did this? I mean, I see the illustration and I see the point you're making, and I see the fact that you bring them into your illustration. But what if you said this? I was working on a project in my garage, and I had this wonderful 12-ounce hammer that was, or 16-ounce hammer, that I was dutifully nailing together my project. I happened to set it down and it fell off the bench and it hit my phone and it crashed my phone. Now it's a story instead of an illustration.
There you go. You know what? I'm going to try that and I'm going to report back to you, see how that changes the whole thing.
Yeah, because I not that the illustration doesn't do its thing. I think it does, but I'm wondering if the story or that illustration in a story format would be even more compelling.
Let's find out. Let's find out. I have some more classes coming up in November and I'll be able to report back.
But thinking along these lines, it sounds like you, like I do, like to use stories in your mentoring and leading of folks, of project teams of your class. So what are some of the techniques you use to, in your mentoring and leading, to use stories?
Just like you said, create an illustrative or allegorical environment within which people can get lost. It takes them away from the classroom and into this mind space that seems to be shared. And in that mind space, we're able to actually build a world that we can actually explore these concepts that we don't necessarily have words for.
Well, and I think that is exactly the important part, because for one moment, you're taking them out of lecture mode or teaching mode and putting them into this sort of, what would I say, almost like a TV mode where they're watching something in their minds. And as a result, they're taking it in. So I like that. I like using them that way.
And the word that you used earlier was experiential. In education, the brass ring is immersive, getting them immersed in the education and the knowledge, not just getting them to see things on a screen, facts and figures, but getting them into where they can use their emotions, not just their intellect, to explore some of these concepts.
And I tell you, one of the techniques I've used along these lines are when I tell a story, I use both a hero story and a failure story. And the hero is almost never myself, unless I'm a participant and something happened as a result of an action. But it's not to make me, the project manager, look good. It's to illustrate something that's happening. Typically, when I use a heroic story where I put someone else in as the arbitrator of good, it would be a person on my team or a person I used to work with or a person I used to work for. The other side of that is also the failure. And I don't mind in these situations, I've had to learn the hard way because this is humbling, but to put myself into a story where I failed, because then you bring yourself into more of a human person as you discuss this with them. You're not like some manager over them, but you're actually a human, making just as fallible as they are. And as a result of your story, they can learn as well. So that's two techniques I use: heroic, someone else; failure, myself.
And you know what's interesting? Joseph Campbell in the 20th century explored this, and he created a whole vast spectrum, just like J.R. Tolkien or George Herbert or Arthur Clarke. They created this world. And Joseph Campbell took myth and religion and all of these things and found a common list of stories. And they include what you're talking about: the hero, failure, and all of the process of going through these various steps. And all of the movies and all the books today can be actually mapped against what they call the monomyth, or the hero's journey of Joseph Campbell.
Great. I've heard that term, monomyth.
Yeah, it's his magnum opus. It's his big work that says these are the stories that seem to speak to all of humanity. And you've pulled out two threads of this great carpet.
The other one that I love to use are things that just recently happened. Before the pandemic and before I retired, I was on an airplane every week and have traveled many, many miles in airplanes. Well, one of the things I loved to do was to observe. By nature, I'm an observant person, but I would observe and then I would jot things down on my Facebook as to how silly this was. Now, I would be careful not to bring in, even sometimes where the airport I was in, but I would make these observations, and pretty soon they caught on by Facebook. And now I had little vignettes that I could now use to open a project meeting or something, just to kind of break the ice and get people interested. They got so popular that if I missed a week, I was getting Facebook people, 30, 40 people a week, sending me messages saying, "Are you okay? We didn't see your story this week."
That's wonderful.
But it was a great icebreaker in project meetings or intense project meetings.
Yeah. That's basically it. I actually was reading a couple articles this week, and I've seen where stories are really effective in managing conflict. It's a smoothing mechanism where if you tell a story in a right way, everybody in the room is feeling the same emotion and having the same thought. And when you put everybody in a room into that state, they automatically gravitate into a single group. Isn't that fascinating?
It is. And especially if you can be a little self-deprecating when you tell the story or when you bring them, that also is very effective.
Yeah, you remind me of one of my old friends back in my pre-technology days. I worked nights at a bank vault, and there were like 5 guys who loved to tell stories. They all had silver hair, and the guard was the best. And he'd always sit back and he'd start saying, "And here I was, minding my own business as usual." And he would commence to tell a story. It was always different, and it was always, like you said, something about his experience in the last 24 hours and how it actually fit with what everybody was going through. He was using it to actually assess the mood and the emotions of everybody, and he would actually use it to reset the mood if it needed to be. He was a brilliant communicator.
And I've had occasion also as a project manager in situations where our project team maybe wasn't pulling together to do something very similar where you could pull in a story or an example or something and make the people see their tasks, mundane as they might be or whatever, see their tasks in a different light. One illustration, I was working on a project in Canada, and it was for a emergency services department. And I had a little trouble having our staff really catch on as to the importance of how this design must work. Until one night I was actually on the floor of the emergency services department and witnessed a homeless person break a wooden chair over the back of one of the workers when she had turned her back on him. I was able to use that very horrible, horrible story with our team to show why we need to design in such a way that our workers could not take their eyes off of the persons that they were helping while still working with screens. I mean, illustrative, but what a design came out of that particular story. Unfortunate for the worker, but a huge boon for the project itself.
Here's another story that's a little different. Yeah, and yours was extreme, and yet it was very, very visceral. And I bet it really drove the message home. They probably think about that story now.
It answered the question, why are we doing this?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what I'm leading to. Yeah. One of my favorite stories is a purpose story and the use of purpose in leadership. And I tell about a grandfather who's leading his grandson around a dam that he helped build when he was a young man. And there's two ways the grandfather can actually lead the grandson. He can go, see that bolt there? See that block of concrete there? See that there? That's me. I did that work. Okay. Now, the grandfather also can say, I did this. And because this work was done, look at how it changed the farms. It took us from a valley that's empty to a rich, lush homestead for 50 families. And it's going to continue to protect us and to help us grow into a strong community. Now, it's, again, the storytelling gets into not just the technical purpose, this is why, this is why, this is what and how, but it gets into the emotional, the tacit or the visceral purpose that there is there too.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite story that you use, for example, that's kind of takes on a life of its own and you can use it in various illustrative environments or even non-technical environments?
I have one that actually works really well. And I started off about 2015. I called it Build a Box. Okay. And I started off by saying, here's how you develop scope. And we're going to use a simple project called Build a Box. And here's the requirements. The box has to be black. The box has to be 20 by 20. And lo and behold, it was one of the most popular parts of the class for the technical stuff because they were able to think about and in their mind hold that box in their hands. Well, what do you know? It came to Agile. And I was thinking, how am I going to build a box for them in Agile? And so I stepped back and I rewrote this back in January. And so instead of building a box, I have a director who comes to me, or a project manager who comes says, we have a tool on the manufacturing floor. And every time somebody moves that tool, they automatically hit that switch. Now, we got to figure out a way to protect that switch from being hit. So let's do it this way. Let's do it in a way that we've figured out this problem before, and we call that predictive. And let's figure out a way we can do this where we've never done anything like this. And it's going to be complicated. Maybe we might find a better way to do it along the way. And this opened up the opportunity for Build a Box to be taught in a predictive manner and also to be taught in an agile manner. So this Build a Box, like you said, took on a life of its own.
I tell my Fred story, and I've used this illustratively for project managers. I've used it in religious circles. I've used it in cultural circles. And it's one where I had an entire team that we moved over to the island of Hawaii to do a large project for the state of Hawaii. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, we brought all of our assertiveness and aggressiveness and watching the clock and doing the schedule. We brought all of that with us until one day Fred pulled me into his office. Fred was a Japanese gentleman. He would tell you he was Okinawan. Mm-hmm. He brought me into his office. And as I sat there, I looked around, and his entire office was dimly lit. He had a water sculpture that was trickling in the background. It was a very peaceful. It was serene. And then he began to help me understand that on the islands, we didn't do things as aggressively or as assertively as my team and myself were working. We did things such that we helped the other person save face, and we all worked together. And it's interesting. I've used that story in many settings, but mainly from a project management point of view. I learned that there's more to managing a project than just arts and charts, schedules and Gantt charts. That you have to take the human part, you have to understand the culture, and you have to work with people. So that story has stuck with me, and I've used it many, many times.
Let's actually map that Fred's behavior against the stories that you described early on. So Fred, number one, took you out of your environment. He did it physically, although storytelling doesn't have to be physical.
Right.
And then he wove a world around you that you could experience not just intellectually, but emotionally. And it was a shared experience.
And it was almost like, what's that? The Karate Kid, Miyagi, or was that his name? Miyagi?
Mr. Miyagi, yeah.
Mr. Miyagi teaching the newbie on the next set of principles. And using for that story by Fred, I would also tell some comical stories, like showing up, we Westerners, I shouldn't say Westerners, we mainlanders showing up in Hawaii in our white shirts and red ties. Mm-hmm. And by lunchtime, he said, we're going shopping. And he introduced me into the world of dress aloha shirts, island style, not tourist style, not those gaudy, colorful touristy things, but what the islanders wear in a business setting. So I would tell these great Fred stories that just kind of worked one after another, that just illustrated where it was that we were.
Yeah, and I use the Karate Kid, Mr. Miyagi, a lot. One of the things that I start off with is I need to somehow unhinge the people from their previous expectations of project management the moment they get into the classroom. So I start off with one of the ground rules in our kickoff that's saying 60% of what we're going to learn is not on the slides. It's how we interact, how we engage, and how we manage this. So it's the observation that you are going to perform with me that you're going to learn through, not the slides. And it takes about a day and a half for people to start clicking on this. And about day 2 is when I bring up the story of wax on, wax off in Karate Kid, where the people are frustrated because they say they're not learning. And Mr. Miyagi says, wax on, wax off. You were learning all the time.
Yeah. Do you find, I know that you teach a lot of people from other cultures than the US, particularly from Asia. Do you find that they connect with that story? Do they know who Mr. Miyagi is?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
It's a very universal movie because it's sensitive to culture. It's open to cultural interpretation, and it speaks to all healthy behavior of all cultures. And it also has personal emotional meaning. It's a maturity movie too, you know, growing up and learning how to be an adult. So it resonates with everybody at every level. Now, what I have learned is that I've had to tailor certain stories to certain cultures, and I had to do my research, not on just, you know, what's culturally appropriate and what's not, but the stories and myths each culture has used to teach its young children. Now, when I do connect back to those other stories, and I don't even have to say I'm talking about Arjuna here and I'm talking about Alexander the Great here. If I just tell the story and weave that in, people click. There's something in their subconscious, and the storytelling is almost better when I don't make that intellectual connection.
Well, and that's a great, and I know you want to talk about what makes for a great story, and you just hit upon one. If you can make the person listening to you feel smart in their own minds because they caught that aha before you even said it, it works even better. But the reason I asked the question before about did the students that you're talking to know about Mr. Miyagi? Because sometimes we tell stories and we're not addressing our audience's understanding. And as a result of that, it doesn't work. And I remember one time talking to my team, and I had this great story that I wanted to illustrate and motivate them or influence them to a motivation. And that, so I told them a story from my boyhood days on a farm in Canada. And I went through this entire story. Well, even the US residents, the people who had grown up here, even if they'd grown up in a city, they understood what it was that I was speaking about and got the point of the story. However, half my team was Indian nationals who had come across in the last 2-3 years and were working as developers on my team. They did not get the story. And so at that point, I had failed in making my point with at least half of my team. Yes. So are there any other things that you can think of that where you know or where you can sense that a story does not work?
Yeah. Okay, so this is going to be really strange, okay? Human beings move their eyes in certain ways, okay? They use stereoptic vision when they're focusing on their prey, when they're trying to study, when they're trying to really understand intellectually, right? They're getting ready to pounce. People create a panoramic view when they're pulling back and seeing the big picture. So when people are going panoramic, I know the story is working well. And when they go stereoptic, they're trying to look for why is there this dissonance? Why is there this confusion? And when people are working on why the confusion, the purpose of the story is lost. And I've discovered this. I actually discovered this when I was starting to study music and singing. And there were some songs that I did really well that compelled people. And it wasn't that they didn't want to be interested. It's that there was something in their brain that was causing confusion and dissonance.
Yeah, I can see that. The one that gets me is the person who tells a story, and I alluded to this a few minutes ago, was a person who always makes themselves the hero of this story. I had a person on my team, and well, I've known this person for years. We gave her the nickname "She Who Must Be Praised."
Uh-huh.
And it was because she was, every time she told a story, it was her being the hero of it, what it was. And it was kind of a look at me. Well, that lost its effectiveness after about the third story,
Right.
because it was no longer about the team. It was always about this person.
So this gets really interesting. So we found some things that don't work. What worked for you? What does work for you?
Well, I've actually, interestingly enough, studied this. And when I say studied this, I think I've talked about on this podcast before that I've been a member of an organization called Toastmasters International for over 30 years. And part of that is to develop and improve our speaking skills. Now, I don't want people writing in terms of saying I need to spend 30 more years doing this. But one of the things that we learned in Toastmasters is how to tell stories. We are given 5 to 7 minutes to make our point. And if we can weave a story in there to help make that point, it really gets our thoughts crystallized. And so storytelling becomes one of those parts of our normal behavior whenever we get up on the platform to speak. But I think one of the things that I learned, one of the good techniques, and I'll talk about several, but one of them we alluded it to before again, also, was the hero's journey, where you get a person into trouble and then you work things out so that he or she survives the ordeal, whatever that is. Perfect time to tell that story is when you're going through a really tough time on a project. You're in this ordeal, now let's work it out and let's come out the other end of this struggle in a good way. How about yourself? Have you picked up some good storytelling techniques that work for you?
Actually, I went to the masters. I did this about 6 years ago when I was going to polish my ability to tell stories. Pixar.
Yeah.
The movie factory, right? They have a set of rules on how to tell good stories. Number one, they're going to be universal. The story somehow resonates with every culture in one way or another. The child who feels out of place, the adult who has a major obstacle in front of them. Again, we're going back to Joseph Campbell. Okay. Now, second of all, clear structure and purpose. You have to be able to see the path. And like you said, the people who can actually see the path 5 or 10 minutes ahead before I tell them, they think themselves really smart, and they are, by the way. This is when you know a story has good, clear structure and purpose. Now, the third one is interesting. A great underdog. Okay. Every
Yes.
Pixar movie has a good underdog, and that's what you were speaking to also. The fourth one is an appeal to our deepest emotions. It somehow resonates with us deeply. And we're talking about the really basic emotions, right? Anger, frustration, joy, and then surprising and unexpected. That weird thing that takes people off balance. It doesn't collapse them, but it turns them around so that something surprising happens. So it causes them to spend more attention on it. And then simple and focused, like you said, 7 or 8 minutes. So Pixar agrees to a point with what you were describing.
Well, I think part of it too, one of the things that I have learned, conciseness is better than, and that's something I'm even learning on our podcast. Sometimes I can wax eloquent on a story and I don't have to. I can leave out some extraneous details. And what happens if you leave those details out, let the people fill them in their own minds. And then what happens is the story is even better because they are a participant in its creation.
Yes.
I had a friend once tell me, says, I was telling this story about driving a red Corvette, and he told this whole story. And he said, what's interesting? I worked on that story for a while, and the next time I talked about it, I was in a very fast sports car, and he went on to tell the story. People came up to him afterwards and thought that was one of the best stories they'd heard. And he said, really, what color was the sports car? And somebody would say blue, somebody would say red, somebody would say black. What was it? Mine was a Corvette, mine was a Lotus, mine was a, and they would have all of these different visions, but because they had the vision that he painted the picture and allowed them to fill in the details, it was a much improved, much more effective story.
So for him, the story was written not just by the storyteller, but the audience as well.
Exactly. Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. You know, you were telling about the ending that is a surprise ending. I think I forget what you called it. I was trying to read. I think you said
surprising and unexpected.
Unexpected, yeah. I was telling a story one time, and everybody thought, "Oh, it's one of these grandiose stories." And I think you and I started this one time in one of our podcasts. But it's a man who was coming up to a bunch of laborers who are working diligently on a building. And he asks the first person, he says, what are you making? And he looks up and he says, about $5 an hour. And so he walks up to the second person. He says, what are you making? He says, well, can't you see I'm making a wall? And the third person comes up and he says, what are you making? And he says, I'm making a grand cathedral. It's going to go reaching to the sky. And he describes this incredible cathedral. And here comes the twist that people don't expect, because people are expecting, wow, this third person is management material. He's visionary. And the end of the story is, and they fired him because they were building a service station. Nobody wanted a cathedral. And just by that twist, you could still make the point of the visionary, but you allowed them to have a little laugh as a result of that surprise ending.
That's great. That's great. I love that.
Yeah. I think, let me add one more to you. You had 7 or 8 points. Very quickly, one more. I think it has to leave a lesson or a piece of wisdom.
Yes.
I think in the reader's mind or in the listener's mind, I think they have to walk away with, can I do that? Or I need to do that.
Right. I need, or I aspire to that.
Yeah.
It actually gives it. Now, Ryan Holiday, in his most recent book, admitted that he was trying to do that in each one of his chapters. And the feedback he got on his book was, no, let the people do that in their minds and put 2 and 2 together. Yeah. Don't force it. Don't lead them there. Create that so that they have to automatically, just like water going down a hill, reach that conclusion themselves.
Yeah. There's also a technique I've used, excuse me, on an occasion, what I would call, and I've seen this written actually in writing, called the false start, where you take the audience down to a certain point, and then you back up to the beginning and take them down a different point. And then at least you've got a couple different ways to compare results from different actions. So pretty much anything that you can do to put a picture in your listener's mind is helpful to make your point.
And what you were describing is what I do with Build a Box.
Yes.
I take them down one path where they're going to build a box, and I take them down another path where they're going to start off with a box and see what they end up with at the end. Yeah, this is these are all great techniques.
Another one I'll tell you not to do. This is a principle of good storytelling, and it's not to say this is how we used to do it. Yeah. Or this is the way we always did it.
Yep.
Don't tell that story.
Right. And there's no reason to. There's no value in that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you actually went through a formal process of research and study and practice. How would you tell somebody to get good at storytelling?
Oh, there's nothing better than to get on your feet and tell the story. And then, and if you have some confidants in your audience, pull them aside afterwards and say, how'd that go? Especially those people who you give permission to be blatantly honest with you. Because quite frankly, the first 2 or 3 or 10 times you're going to fail. You may fall flat in your face, and that's okay. Because when you're failing, as long as you fail forward, I'm starting to use triteness now. But if you fail forward so that every step is a learning experience, just get on your feet and do it. It would be my first advice.
Very good. And
how about yourself? What do you think?
I agree with you. Don't look at your practice and as a failure that you didn't do well. Look at it more from an exploration standpoint. And don't measure yourself by, did I succeed or fail? Measure yourself by, what did I learn? And it's right in line with what you were talking about. You're moving forward. You're not failing backwards.
Well, and you've told me before that you're a musician.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go on a limb here and think that at some point you played Beethoven's Fifth. and how did you do the first time you tried? And insert anything that you worked on. How did you do the first time you tried to play that piece, whatever piece it was?
Let me talk to you a little bit about my background. Okay, I'm a professionally trained singer. And I loved lyrical songs. I loved rich, deep songs from the 19th century. But every voice teacher I had said, nope, you're not going to do that. You're going to go to the 18th century German and hear all these wonderful tunes, la, 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 la. And I just hated it until one of my coaches said, Tim, don't sing. Go through the notes, go through the words, and paint a picture. Tell a story. Create a world around them. And there's a little song by Schubert called "The Fish," Die Forelle, and it talks about a fish that a fisher is trying to catch. And the fish is hiding and scared. And that little fish, however silly it is, outsmarts the fisherman. And I fell in love with that story. And that became my favorite story I told when I was singing. And it actually took advantage of my vocal range as well as my expression. And it opened up the world to me. That's when I first really understood the power of storytelling. It was the first time I actually was on stage and the music stopped and people hesitated before they clapped. It was a showstopper. And it wasn't just a showstopper for them. It was a showstopper for me.
So the storytelling helped you in your tongue-tied here. Your storytelling helped you in your music, but I bet the first time you tried that piece, you thought you could do better.
Oh, not do better. I failed. I can actually say I failed. I totally disconnected from the audience because I was looking at it from a mechanical set of steps and actions instead of trying to weave all these pieces together in an image.
Yeah.
Again, we think about communication as sharing information two ways, but until you really start getting what a story is and what a story does, you don't really understand the concept of communication.
You don't. And you asked me earlier, what are some of the techniques that I use to get good at storytelling? In my earlier days, I would plan. I knew something was coming up in my next status meeting, say as a project manager. So I would plan what I was going to say the night before, and I would take a story that I was going to tell, and I would write it out. And then I would wordsmith it. And I wouldn't memorize it, but I would get the concepts and the words down so that the next day when I told it, it was a natural progression from the day before wordsmithing. But when I told it, it was much more planned. It was much more effective. Now, you and I tell stories on these podcasts all the time. I have not yet written one of them down. Why? Because back then, I took the time to learn how to do it so that now I can tell a story. Maybe I'm not as eloquent as I want to be with every story, but I can still bring up a story use it to make my point, and hopefully entertain our audience, or at least intrigue them in terms of understanding what that point is.
Yeah, Ben Franklin actually has a set of steps that he says, this is how a good person writes. And it's through observation and analysis and review. And it's setting the material aside for a little bit of time and coming back to it with a little bit of perspective. Yeah, you nailed it on the head.
And I suspect that most of our audience knows who Jerry Seinfeld is. I don't have his exact quote, but I remember reading something about him that he will take 2 weeks on a 5-word phrase to get it down to 4 words to get it perfect for his audience. Now, as project managers, we don't have 2 weeks to wordsmith down to the last syllable. But you can see that, I mean, he was a very, very successful comedian, had a very, very successful TV show because he spent time on the craft of storytelling to the point of trying to remove a word or put in the exact precise word to get his joke across or his meaning across.
It's that precision.
Yeah.
It's that precision where experience tells you, okay, that's leading people away from the story. That's leading people in the direction of the story. Yeah. And the story leads people to the objective or the result. And so going through this over and over again, I can see why this would make somebody like Jerry Seinfeld very, very good. Precision, though. Communications, this is one of the things that we forget, either as managers or project managers. Language and communication done well are powerful, but that level of precision does not come without lots of practice.
You know, and I'm going to confess something to our audience right now. Once in a while, I'll go back. Often I'll go back and I'll re-listen to one of our podcasts and I'll cringe. I'll go, oh, I wish I would have said it differently. Oh, I wish I hadn't said that long pause there. Oh, I wish I hadn't said that huge awe. But you know what? Compared to how this would have gone 10 years ago, because of the practice of storytelling and how we can weave it into our communication now, it's far better. People would not have wanted to listen to me necessarily about 10 years ago. So there is something to say, just get up and do it.
Right. So what other benefits can come from what has storytelling taught you or given you that you can actively use in your management?
Well, one of the things is it has helped me to become a better listener. And it's almost a backwards thinking, because what I'll do is I'll pick up on something my staff or my colleague says, and it'll trigger something in my mind so that I can react or respond in a way that imparts some wisdom, but often with a story. But if I hadn't been actively listening, I might have missed that opportunity to make an effective point. How about yourself?
The same, active listening. I'll add two others. Number one, engagement. I didn't really understand this word engagement connected with stakeholders and communication until I learned about the effectiveness of storytelling. It gets people involved and interested and curious. And the moment I understood that as what engagement was, everything fell into place. And the third thing is binding people as a group. And you're right, you are a person that's a part of that group. You're the storyteller. And sometimes the story is bigger than what you're telling.
Well, and I talked earlier, one of the benefits that I've seen, and I think you as a master teacher would see this, is when the light bulbs go on. I mean, that is a huge. When I'm on a platform speaking to an audience of 20 people or 200 people, and I see those light bulbs popping, I tell you, it exhilarates me, not because I'm feeling like some sort of star on stage. No. I'm feeling like my message is hitting home. And that's huge. That's huge.
Yeah, it's like being a parent and watching your children open presents at Christmas.
Exactly.
That's what it feels like when you tell a good story and people, quote unquote, get it. Yeah, that's
Well, and you talked earlier, a little bit earlier, about being part engagement in that, in a situation like that. I can tell you one of the huge benefits several times, but one of the huge benefits that I have learned from storytelling is actually getting a lucrative engagement, i.e. a contract, because of my ability to weave a story and make a point. And I remember one time, this wasn't that actually that long ago, that I was in a estate, and it turned out there was 13 bidders to a fairly large contract to provide oversight for a contract for a large SI project. And as I was sitting there and I'm thinking, 13, what chance do I have? Well, I got shortlisted, brought in front of a panel of questioners. I got brought into this room of a U-shaped table. 16 inquiring people wanted to know what I knew. And I was able to answer every question from them and several times illustrate a story that they could relate to, and ended up winning that. And I asked the project manager afterwards, I said, 13 people, how did I get picked? He said, it wasn't even close. It wasn't even close. Now I have just broken one of my rules, making myself the hero of the story. But the point is, storytelling earned me a lot of money in that and several other situations.
Right. Now here's the big question. If you were to develop an aspect of storytelling, what would you like to get better at?
You go first, Tim. I want to hear your answer first.
Okay, I actually have 4.
You have what? Sorry?
I have 4 pieces that I want to develop.
Okay, good.
I'm a little selective, but I have a lot of growth here. Number 1, what does the audience really need?
Yeah.
What information and what knowledge do they need? Or are they in an argument or conflict? Do they need to resolve this? I need to be better at that. Number 2, choosing the right story for the right need. Sometimes I get the wrong story and it leads us down a bad path, like you said. Number 2, I need more practice. I've been doing this for 7 or 8 years. I could get better. I cannot imagine how good I'll be in 10 years, but I want to get there. And also using the silence between the sentences. You said something important, Merv. You said that people need to fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
You need, as a storyteller, to give people a little breathing space when you're telling a story so they can do that.
Sometimes it's called, we used to laugh and we used to call it the pregnant pause. I'm not sure why I got that demeanor or that name, but if you think about it, there are times when you're telling something and then you stop and then you go on. And in that stop, it allows people to either go back over what you just talked to them, because it's a major point, that's why you stopped, or to fill in the blanks. Yeah, that absolutely is a powerful, powerful technique in storytelling.
Pablo Casals respected this so much that whenever he was asked why he was such a good cello player, he said, well, I had to learn to play the notes, but I also had to learn to play the silence. When you look at poetry, it's not just the words and the image, it's the actual rhythm to which you speak. And I found that being able to manipulate the rhythm, I can actually manipulate a little bit the emotional state, not to change people's emotions, but change the level of emotions, bring up excitement, bring down to relaxation, and this type of thing. And it's fascinating. I'd love to spend much more time on this.
For me, I think the technique that, well, I don't think, I know the technique that I keep working on is the whole aspect of delivering that story. And as long as I've been in Toastmasters, and it's been many years, I'm also part of the National Speakers Association of the United States. And as part of that whole process, we learn techniques, we pick up on techniques, we get mentored by people who are magical storytellers. And so even from that perspective, I'm still always learning, always trying a different thing. And I mentioned the organization called Toastmasters a few minutes ago. Toastmasters has this annual contest that begins at the club level. Now, there's probably, I'm guessing 300,000 Toastmasters in the world, and about 20 to 30,000 of them enter the annual contest. And it works its way up until you end up with what they call the world champion of public speaking. Now, the person who wins at that level is truly, truly a gifted speaker. I was fortunate enough, and by the way, these are 5 to 7 minute speeches, 7 minutes and 31 seconds, and you are disqualified. They give you 30 seconds for a little bit of leeway to finish up. I was fortunate in that time to actually end up in the top 30, meaning I took third in one of the final 10 rankings before they went to the World Championship. Now, here's what I will tell you. That 7-minute speech cost me over 100 hours of wordsmithing, practicing, getting up in front of people, delivering, coming back, changing things. 100 hours for a 7-minute speech. Did I win? I wasn't crowned world champion, but I absolutely won in terms of my ability to weave a story and keep an audience engaged. So there is some method to being able to hone that delivery technique in such a way that you keep your folks engaged.
Yeah. It's a skill that can be practiced, and you can surprise yourself at how good you can get.
Yeah. Someone, and you probably know this story better than I do, but someone asked a world-renowned concert pianist. They said, "Oh, I wish I could play the piano like you do." And they said, "No, you don't." She says, "Well, no, I do." She says, "No, you don't. Otherwise, you'd be at home practicing right now instead of sitting here talking to me," or something along those lines. The idea was that this world-renowned pianist had put his entire life into making that one presentation.
That's the mindset. If you want to be world-class, that's the mindset you have to be. This is each achievement is merely a step to the next achievement. And that's all that you're focused on. And you eliminate anything that takes you away, and you add anything that brings you towards it.
So, Tim, put yourself in the chair of a young or a first-time project manager, or even a medium qualified project manager listening to us today. You think that we have convinced that person that storytelling is an important quiver in their weaponry?
I hope so.
I didn't say that right. It's an important arrow in their quiver is what I meant to say.
It's a critical arrow. Ensuring proper communication is 90% of the work you do in projects. And everybody who's been a project manager for more than 5 years knows this. And storytelling has an opportunity not just to share explicit information, but to share tacit information, which is the whole, that's the brass ring right there, to be able to compel people to connect with the knowledge and wisdom in such a way that they can seize ownership quicker.
Yeah. You know, we've heard as project managers that a picture is worth 1,000 words. I think word pictures in the form of a story could be worth 10,000 words.
Yes. I agree with you totally.
So on that note, where would people discover you if they wanted to pop a story off against your experience?
Find me over at LinkedIn. I'm there. I'm quite busy, but if I have time, I usually talk to people who link to me. And from time to time, I share my experiences as well as my success and failures. And for you, Merv?
Same, Merv Jersak over at LinkedIn. And I think it's something like this, storytelling, where you could get into a discussion with a wider audience, I think would lead to incredible engagement on something like LinkedIn. So I'm asking our listeners to join us on LinkedIn and ask about or tell us about your experiences in storytelling.
That would be wonderful. Well, as always, Merv, thank you so much for the engaging conversation. We're looking forward to many, many more in the future.
And we hopefully will have, well, not hopefully, I know we'll have many more stories in the podcasts to come.
Thanks again.
See ya.